Are you ready for round two of my debate with artificial intelligence about Book of Mormon evidence? In a prior video, I did a debate with Grok, which is a version of artificial intelligence, and we debated the Bat Creek stone. I feel like I won round one on points, even though Grok refused to concede that the Bat Creek stone was authentic. I got it to concede most of the key points and essentially got it to a ridiculous position. I think I won on points, but I'll leave it to you to judge on that. And this, we're going to do round two. This is going to be a debate with artificial intelligence on Book of Mormon DNA. In particular, we're going to look at Haplogroup X. I'm going to do a debate with AI, particularly Grok, asking it questions related to Haplogroup X. And as you probably know, the mainstream science, mostly they'll be out there saying that all of the Native American DNA came from Asia. It's all Asian DNA. As I've presented in previous videos, that's actually not true. There are DNA types for Native Americans that did not originate in Asia. Haplogroup X is the most famous of those. I'm going to have a debate with Grok, with AI, asking it about Haplogroup X, and we'll see what it says and to see if we can get it to admit that Haplogroup X came from the Middle East and may be a DNA type that fits with the Book of Mormon. We'll see. So here we are with the artificial engine AI Grok's website. You can get there multiple ways. One of the ways you can get there is just go to grok.com. And I upgraded to Super Grok so that I could ask it all the questions I want. And what I'll do is I'll ask it questions about the DNA. We'll get its responses and we'll do follow-up, and like it'll be sort of a debate style where I do follow-up questions to Grok, and we'll see if we can get it to admit that some of the Native American DNA comes from the Middle East and could potentially fit the Book of Mormon. We'll see. Okay, we'll start with the first question. Okay, so here's the first question I have for Grok. In 50 words or less, yes or no, is mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X, specifically mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X2A, an authentic ancestral DNA type for Native Americans? Yes, it admits. So mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X2A is an authentic ancestral DNA type for Native Americans. So let's do the follow-up question. So here is the follow-up question, question two. Then, in 50 words or less, where did mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X originate? Now remember, most mainstream scientists will say all Native American DNA is Asian, that it all originated in Asia. Many of them do not want to admit that mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X actually originated in the Middle East, also known as the Near East, but we'll see what Grok has to say. Okay, very interesting. So this part of the round is much easier than expected. So here, Grok is acknowledging, which is actually contrary to what most of the mainstream scientists will tell you, what the anti-Mormons, Exmos will tell you. They'll all say, oh, haplogroup X is Asian. That's Asian DNA. That's not true. As I've said in prior videos, when you look at where in the old world it could have come from, the locations in the old world with the most diversity and the highest concentrations for haplogroup X are in the Near East, also known as the Middle East. So Israel, the Levant region. And so it's interesting here that Grok actually goes right away and admits that mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X originated where? In the Near East. So that's step one that fits the Book of Mormon. I'll go ahead and do a follow-up question just to have it state how it reached that conclusion. Okay, so here is my third question. This is actually a two-part question. Hopefully it handles that fine. I ask, okay, so it acknowledged that haplogroup X likely originated in the Near East. I say in 200 words or less, what is the rationale for concluding that it most likely originated in the Near East? And more specifically, is there a particular place in the Near East that it most likely originated? Let's see what the answer is. Okay, let's read the answer. It says the rationale for concluding that haplogroup X likely originated in the Near East stems from its high diversity and basal lineages in the region, suggesting ancient presence. Okay, this is actually information that I put in my book, The Face of a Nephite. There are a number of peer-reviewed articles that found that. So on that first point, when I argue that haplogroup X came from the Near East, people will dispute that. But when you look in the old world at where there is the, as it says here, the highest diversity, showing the longest presence and mutations, and also the oldest lineages that's in the Near East. There's another factor here too, which is it also has the highest concentrations, which is another point which it doesn't raise here. Then notes that there are genetic studies. It cites a couple of them that shows where in the Near East in particular, the Levant. The Levant includes Israel. Greatest variation in populations from the Levant, Anatolia, and the Caucasus, indicating deep-rooted origin. And then we'll have to get into the dates because it's proposing that it was much too long ago. What we'll find out is those dates are assumed based on a full theory of evolution, time frames of the populations being there 100,000 years ago, and then 30, 40,000 years ago, and then 20,000 years ago, finally coming over to America. So Grok is relying on and using an extremely old uh, time frame. We'll have to get into the time aspect of it and the basis for that. So that'll be a significant part of the argument that I have with Grok. But anyway, but it says where, and it points specifically to the Israel area, and then they think it spread. Um, anyway, so shows a Near Eastern source, while precise pinpointing. So, and on the part about where in particular in the Near East, it says precise pinpointing is challenging, but the Levant, which encompasses modern day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, stands out as a likely origin for this Native American DNA line due to the archaeological and genetic evidence of this haplogroup X there. And then it says there are other plausible alternatives. So I'm going to say that on this first point, it was actually much easier than expected. The artificial intelligence actually went against, surprisingly to me, what many of the mainstream sites and articles will say, saying that haplogroup X is Asian. Actually, Grok says, looking at the data, looking at these peer-reviewed studies, it agrees with what we've been saying, Rod Meldrum, me, and others, that the data actually shows that it did come from the Near East. And while it says precise pinpointing is challenging, it specifically identifies the Levant, Israel, as a likely origin for haplogroup X, which is this Native American DNA. Okay, let's go to the next question. We'll now go start to talk about the dating because that's the key issue is it thinks Grok is saying, okay, this is Native American DNA, but it's tens of thousands of years ago, which would put it long before a Book of Mormon timeframe. So we're going to have to go into the dating aspect. Let's do a follow-up question. Okay, question 4. So let's ask it about that dating. It said that it thought haplogroup X originated over 30,000 years ago. Let's ask, in 50 words or less, what is the basis for saying that it originated over 30,000 years ago? It says the basis for estimating haplogroup X's origin over 30,000 years ago comes from genetic studies analyzing mutation rates and diversity in its lineages, particularly in Near Eastern populations. Molecular clock calculations indicate 30 to 40,000 years ago. Okay, so what it's saying is it gives this date based on mutation rates using the molecular clock. So we'll need a brief explanation of what is the molecular clock and how to do that. Maybe I can just go ahead and ask Grok to explain it to us. So we'll just have Grok explain it for us. The molecular clock, essentially what they do is they assume the full theory of evolution. They assume that, humans evolved from, common, from common ancestors like the chimpanzee. They think that took, an inordinate amount of time, so millions of years. And so they look at the time frames for humans as being, 100,000 years or so. And so what they're doing is that once you take that huge full evolutionary time frame where evolution is happening without a creator, without intelligent design, without anything guiding evolution, and you're looking at the huge amount of times then that it would take for everything to evolve to get to where it is, then if you assume all of that, then you can look back at how far back in terms of mutations on this evolutionary tree are we talking about? And they use that to then sort of estimate um, time frames. So when they're saying here 30 to 40,000 years ago, they're saying it's really about 1/3 of the way back on the evolutionary tree of humanity. But we'll go ahead and have Grok explain, see what it says. Okay, it says the molecular clock is a method used to estimate the timing of evolutionary events based on the rate of genetic mutations. Correct, that's what I said. It assumes mutations occur at a relatively constant rate over time. Notice that this is a big assumption that can't necessarily be assumed to be true. So it's assuming a full evolutionary thesis, and then it's assuming that the mutations occur at a relatively constant rate over time. If you assume all of that, then what it says is that mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X, you look at the number of differences and mutations, you can calculate how long ago it probably diverged. That's how they get the 30,000, type plus time frame that they're saying that it left the Middle East. That's how they calculate the divergence time. And then it also claims that they calibrate it with known archaeological or fossil dates to refine those estimates. But what we'll find is that actually isn't true for haplogroup X. There's no known archaeological or fossil dates that calibrate or verify any of those estimates. It says for haplogroup X, it points to those two studies which estimated the origin of 30 to 40,000 years ago. Let's do the follow-up question asking about, well, then, if you're saying it's calibrated with known archaeological or fossil dates, what archaeological or fossil dates are used for haplogroup X or verify haplogroup X in particular? So this is the follow-up question. As indicated, it says it's based off of the evolutionary theory, assumptions about the mutation rate. So it's looking at the number of mutations that have occurred from DNA lines in the old world and looking at the number of differences there. There's only about 4 differences, but separating Native Americans from the old world. And so it's taking those differences from the mutations that have occurred, and then it's estimating how long ago that occurred. And it's using such a long time frame that even if it's only the 4 mutation difference, it's pointing to 30 to 40,000 years ago. And it says that, molecular clock dates are calibrated with known archaeological or fossil dates. But I ask specifically, what archaeological or fossil dates, if any, have been used to calibrate the molecular clock specifically for haplogroup X to support an origin of more than 30,000 years ago? And I should say in 50 words or less. Otherwise, Grok gives you really wordy answers. And it acknowledges. So this is a lot like the video we had with the Bat Creek Stone, where as I said, I thought I won on points because even though Grok refused to admit that the mainstream view was wrong, it would increasingly get itself into ridiculous positions where it'll essentially acknowledge that it actually had no evidence for the statement that it was making. And so here, look, it specifically acknowledges that there are no specific archaeological or fossil dates that have been used to calibrate the molecular clock for haplogroup X or support that date that it's giving. Instead, it's looking at, okay, broader human events, again, going back to this longer theory of humanity on the world, and the mutation rate estimates broader. But it says there are no specific archaeological or fossil dates that calibrate or have been used for haplogroup X to justify this 30,000 plus year ago date that it says. Okay, let's do a follow-up question then. Okay, so we'll do this follow-up. So Grok, in 50 words or less, isn't it true that the molecular clock is based on average mutation rates, but actually mutations occur randomly, and there are only a few mutational differences between haplogroup X2A in Native Americans from haplogroup X in the Near East? And then what we'll do with follow-ups is this, to show that it's taking these assumptions of how much time it would take between particular mutations, but the mutations actually occur randomly. You don't know when they're going to occur, and you're only talking about a few mutational differences between Native Americans and the ancestors. So we'll get to the argument that I'll make in a little bit, that you really can't reliably say how long ago the mutations occurred, but we'll see. Okay, it agrees. So Grok says, yes, the molecular clock uses average mutation rates and its random mutations. So it admits that it uses average mutation rates even though mutations are random. And it admits that haplogroup X2A, which is in Native Americans, has only a few mutational differences from haplogroup X in the Near East, in particular in the Old World, which reflects a relatively recent divergence consistent with migration timelines. So let's do a follow-up. Okay, so I think this is a pretty good follow-up question. So it acknowledges, again, it's admitted that Native American haplogroup X DNA actually originated in the Middle East or Near East. It just says that it happened more than 30,000 years ago. It's admitted that that's based on the molecular clock, which relies on average mutation rates, even though mutations are actually random. And so the idea is that even though the mutations are random, if it happens enough time, you can sort of estimate how long it happened. So a typical example of this is like, say you're rolling a die, a six-sided die, and say you roll a one. All right, that happens 1 in 6 times. Now, if say you've rolled 3 ones, you can't necessarily say that that happened in exactly 18 rolls. You would say three rolls of one, so that would be 18 rolls, 1 in 6 times. So you'd get, on average, 3 rolls and 3 rolls of a one and 18 rolls. But anybody who's familiar with rolling dice in board games or whatever will understand that it's random, so you just don't know. You might get lucky, you might roll 1 in the first 3 rolls. You might get unlucky, and it might take 50 or more rolls to roll those. When you get high enough numbers of events, then you can say, okay, it's going to roughly be about that 1 in 6 times. But when you're only talking about it occurring a few times, you can't say with only a few events that you can't reliably estimate how many rolls it took. So using that analogy here, what I'm saying is that in 50 words or less, since there are only a few mutational differences between the DNA found in modern Native Americans from the ancestors in the Near East, is those few mutational differences, like 4, is that really enough differences to be able to reliably use an average estimate to determine when there was a divergence of Native Americans from the Old World? And we'll see what Grok says. Okay, it says few mutational differences between haplogroup X2A Native Americans and Near Eastern haplogroup X does suggest recent divergence. but small sample size and random mutation rates do limit precision. So what it's saying here is that, yeah, when you only have a few mutations and since mutation rates are random, it does limit your precision. In other words, it's saying, yeah, it does affect the reliability to be able to determine dates. But it still says and estimates that the molecular clock will support a divergence. Now it says 15 to 20,000 years ago. All right, let's do a follow-up question. Okay, so we're going to try this follow-up question for Grok. Grok is pretty smart. I think that it'll get the analogy here. We're going to try this die rolling analogy that I talked about because rolling a die really, the mutations that occur as they're assumed to occur randomly. So it really is like rolling a die. And so I kind of use an analogy here and let's see how it responds. So what I say is in 100 words or less, for events that occur randomly, like mutations or like rolling a die. So for events that occur randomly and that occur on average once in 200 events, like rolling a 1 on a 200-sided die, or like a mutation that sticks only once in about 200 generations, when you use their estimated mutation rate, the evolutionary molecular clock mutation rate, it varies, but it comes around to where a mutation sticks only about once every 200 or more generations based on their assumption. In actuality, I think that the mutations happen much faster than that, but this is the assumed rate. So again, we ask, so if something only occurs like once every 200 events and you only see it occur a few times, can you really reliably say how long it took to happen? So I say, let's assume that you see that a 1 has been rolled only 4 times. So this is like where the Native Americans have had only 4 mutations. Can you really reliably say how long it took, how many rolls or how many generations it took, which is what it's using for the molecular clock? Can you really reliably say how long it took to roll those 4 ones or to have those 4 mutations that stick? Let's see what Grok says. Okay. So it says, with random events like mutations or rolling a 1 on a 200-sided die, observing only 4 occurrences, it limits the reliable estimation of the total rolls or generations. The expected number of rolls the average would be, okay, you expect 800 generations. So this is what they use for Haplogroup X DNA, and they see these 4 mutations, and it's like, okay, well, we assume that a mutation sticks only once every 200 generations. So we're assuming it's, 800 generations times 20 years on average per, each generation that occurs. Then that's how you get a 16,000, year estimate. But it's only 4 mutations. And so the randomness has, as it says, high variance. It says, for example, in the die rolling example, to roll 4 ones, it could easily happen in 400 rolls or 1,200 rolls. We know that, right? So in the same way, when you say, when did haplogroup X come over, they don't know. They might, even if they were right on the average number of generations, it would, the average number, the average mutation rate, you don't know whether those 4 mutations come quickly, just like if you get lucky with a die, or if it takes longer. Small sample sizes, like only 4 mutations, make precise dating unreliable. And so its statistical confidence would require more data. So that's a good admission by Grok. Let's go ahead and do a follow-up question. So we've talked a little bit about the averages and about how the averages aren't reliable when you're only talking about 4 mutations from the Native American version of haplogroup X with its ancestors in the Old World. In particular, Native Americans who have this haplogroup X DNA, it's only 4 mutations apart, different from the closest types that are found back in the Near East. And then, but there's another line too, which is that average mutation rate that they're assuming is it really correct or not? Like I said before, they're assuming rates that are really slow. They're assuming that humans have been around on the earth for 200 to 300,000 years. If it's possible that humans, and I think it's true that humans have been on the earth a much shorter time than that, um, then is there any evidence of that? And the answer is yes. So they have done pedigree studies where they'll look at individuals and then they know where their ancestors are, they know where their ancestors' graves are, and so they can test various generations of pedigree and then do it with a lot of different people. And they sort of did a study. It's like, okay, we'll do a lot of different people, we'll do their pedigrees, and we'll see how often do mutations actually occur. And what they found is that the mutations actually occur 10 or more times faster than what the evolutionary assumed rate was. So while they were assuming that humans had been on the earth for 200,000 plus years, when they did pedigree studies to test, well, how long are these mutation rates? Can we actually test how long they actually happen versus just estimated? What they found was that they occurred at a much faster rate. And I go into that in my book, In the Face of a Nephite, if you're interested. But let's just say what Grok says here. So I ask him, in 100 words or less, do pedigree studies indicate the possibility of a much faster mutation rate than the rate that's being used for the molecular clock? And we'll see what it says. Okay, it says pedigree studies, which track the mutations across generations in families, like I said, often suggest faster mutation rates. Okay, so it's admitting. So in the pedigree studies, they do often suggest faster mitochondrial DNA. That's the type of DNA we're talking about. They suggest faster mitochondrial DNA mutation rates than those used in molecular clocks for using the deep evolutionary timescales. And it gives a couple of examples. And then this is an example that showed higher mutation rates in the pedigree charts, in the pedigree testing of DNA. And then it starts to give its theory for why the discrepancy arises. It says that what the pedigree charts are doing is they're capturing like short-term transient mutations that don't stick, and it gives that theory. But I want to challenge it a little bit on that. Let's go ahead and do a follow-up question about whether this rationale for why the pedigree DNA mutation rates, the actual tested DNA mutation rates, don't match the estimated theoretical mutation rates. We'll see whether this is just like a post hoc rationalization or whether they anticipated that the pedigree rates would be faster. Let's check. Okay, so let's do its follow-up question. So like I said, it admits that the pedigree studies where they tested the actual mutation rates got much faster rates than the evolutionary assumed rates, mutation rates. But then it says, but this is due to, and it calls it transient mutations that happen and then they say revert and, and aren't found anymore. But I'm going to do a follow-up question to it, and I'm going to say, okay, well, in 50 words or less, you say that the faster mutation rates that were found in pedigree studies are due to these transient mutations. But isn't it true that when they tested the mutation rates in pedigree studies, they expected to see the similar rates from the evolutionary studies and were surprised by seeing much higher rates of mutation, as much as 10 times faster than expected? We'll see if Grok admits this. Okay, great. Well, it admitted it. So it says yes, pedigree studies, and it gives one example of it, found the actual mitochondrial mutation rates up to 10 times faster than expected, surprising researchers. So again, if you were to apply this to the date, so like when they said a haplogroup X, well, 30,000 years ago or 16,000 years ago. Well, if if the rates actually occur 10 times faster, then you're talking about 1600, 3000 years ago. It fits right into the Book of Mormon timeframes. And this is something that Rod Meldrum has been arguing and is true, which is that they're using an evolutionary theory, but when you actually test the mutation rates the rates that you get are like 10 times faster. And when you apply that, suddenly Haplogroup X, which is this Native American DNA, it not only originated in the Middle East, specifically potentially the Levant, Israel, but when you apply these faster mutation rates, which is what they actually get in the mutation rate testing, it would fit right in the Book of Mormon time frame. So it really does fit the Book of Mormon. So he says these higher rates contrast with the slower rates that are used for the estimates it just gave us for the haplogroup X. Okay, great. So it's been admitting a lot. Let's go ahead and do a couple more follow-up questions. Okay, so this I think is an appropriate follow-up. Again, so I was relying on the molecular clock, but then I also ask about if there's any other evidence outside of the molecular clock that points to haplogroup X2A being as long ago, coming to the Americas as long as ago as it claims. So I say, in 100 words or less, you've given dates for haplogroup X2A that say that it came to the Americas more than 15,000 years ago. But is there any actual direct evidence of haplogroup X2A being in the Americas that long ago? Let's see what it says. Okay, so it admits no. It says that there is no direct evidence. There's no ancient DNA that confirms that haplogroup X2A came to the Americas over 15,000 years ago. Instead, it's based on the molecular clock calculations and mutation rates. It says that there's archaeological data supporting human presence in the Americas by about 15,000 years ago. That would be looking at sort of Clovis type stuff where they use the carbon dating, but that's not haplogroup X2A. They haven't found any haplogroup X2A that carbon dates that far back. Admits that there's no X2A specific DNA from that far back that's been found. Current evidence relies on indirect genetic inferences, not direct fossil or ancient DNA confirmation. So it admits that it doesn't actually have, it's all based on these estimated dates. It doesn't actually have DNA going that far back. Now, I do know that a key thing that many people rely on for X2A being too old is Kennewick Man. He doesn't go back more than 15,000 years ago, but many will say that he dates back to about 9,000 years ago, and he was haplogroup X2A. In my Face of a Nephite book, that is a sculpture of Kennewick Man as reimagined based off the skull. It was done by the Smithsonian. So the Smithsonian has Kennewick Man's skull. They did sort of a artistic reconstruction based off of the skull type, came out looking like this, which is done by the Smithsonian. And he turns out that he is this haplogroup X DNA. He has this haplogroup X DNA, so he kind of fits this potential Middle Eastern, Near Eastern ancestry for Native Americans. That's why I say, potential face of a Nephite. I think he came to the Americas. I mean, I think he is one of the Nephites that their ancestors came to the Americas, and he has this Middle Eastern X2A DNA type. Now, the problem is that the mainstream science will say that his carbon dating dates him back to 9,000 years ago. So we'll get Grok to talk about that, and then we'll just briefly address, because as I describe in the book, it's actually some of the carbon date results for him only date to 2000 to 2,700 years ago, which actually fits the Book of Mormon time frame, while some of the other dates produced older dates. And then in that book, I do a pretty long discussion, and it's too long for this particular video, but I have done, let me show you. So if you go to my channel and you search for the Kennewick Man, I did one on, actually that's going to pull up, that's going to leave my channel and go to check all kinds of others. So let's pull up the Kennewick Man one. So I did one on the age of Kennewick Man, and what I do, I go really deep into it because he was buried. I go into the carbon date testing. I go into what the different carbon dates showed, that I talk about the different theories, and then I talk about how, with his particular burial and the events around it, how he really has to have been one of the newer dates. He can't be as old as they are claiming that he is. It's this video right here, The Face of a Nephite, How Old is Kennewick Man? I did about a 28-minute video going into explaining why the dating actually shows him to be more recent and fits Book of Mormon timeframes, and isn't as old as is commonly understood. But let's do a follow-up question about Kennewick Man. We'll do that and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so here's just the kind of gives the information about Kennewick Man, and then I ask whether outside of Kennewick Man have there been any showings of this Middle Eastern DNA, Haplogroup X2A DNA, having been before Book of Mormon timeframes. So as I say here, other than Kennewick Man, who was Haplogroup X2A and who is commonly thought to have lived over 8,000 years ago, other than him, has there been any other DNA showing that Haplogroup X was in the Americas before Book of Mormon timeframes? Here I say 2,600 years ago, so it puts it about 600 BC. Let's see what it says. Okay, it admits that other than Kennewick Man, there is no ancient DNA evidence indicating Haplogroup X2A in the Americas before Book of Mormon timeframes. So when they say that Haplogroup X2A, the Haplogroup X is too old to be for the Book of Mormon, it is only based on those two theories, the mutation rate, which again is wrong and assumes things, averages that can't be relied on for only four differences, only four mutations. And then in terms of the other harder evidence, the archaeological evidence, the DNA testing, Haplogroup X has been found in the Americas dating to 2,000, 2,100 years ago. That's been common. They found that, for example, in locations in Ohio and Illinois are two examples of the Haplogroup X DNA being back there 2,000 years ago, which fits the Book of Mormon timeframe. Outside of that, there is only one skeleton that showed a Haplogroup X DNA, which is thought to be before Book of Mormon times, and that is this Kennewick Man. And as it says, no one besides him has been found more than 2,600 years ago. They do think that there was presence in modern Native Americans, but that's based on molecular clock estimates. But there are no other ancient remains with X2A before Book of Mormon timeframes older than 2,600 years ago that have been identified. So it really just comes down to Kennewick Man. And as I point out in the book, the carbon dating for Kennewick Man, while they say that he was over 8,000 years ago, actually some of the carbon dates for him date only to about 2,000 to 2,700 years ago, which would fit Book of Mormon timeframes. But I'll do a follow-up question. Okay, so this will be just a follow-up question on Kennewick Man. So we just got Grok to admit that outside of Kennewick Man is the only one with Haplogroup X, this Middle Eastern DNA type in the Americas. The only one who they've been able to show would precede Book of Mormon timeframes is this Kennewick Man. And then I ask it about Kennewick Man, then I say, okay, but in 100 words or less, Kennewick Man, yes, is commonly said to be carbon dated to over 8,000 years ago. But isn't it true that in Chapter 3, specifically Table 3.5 of the book Kennewick Man, I'll show you that book. So I keep it here. It's like a 600-page collection of all the different studies that were done on Kennewick Man. They call it Kennewick Man, the Scientific Investigation of an Ancient American Skeleton. And then the Chapter 3 is the one on the carbon dating, and the 3.5 is on page 69, and that's the one that has the carbon dates here. Let me just show you on the screen if you're interested in getting the book for yourself. It's this one here, if you're interested in getting it from Amazon. It's kind of an expensive book to get, at least in the hardcover fashion, and you really can't get it online. But if you were interested in Kennewick Man, it is the most exhaustive collection, the best collection of the scientific studies about him. So if you're going to know about Kennewick Man, you really have to have that book because that is the key collection of studies about him. But anyway, so I say, isn't it true that in chapter 3 of that book, which is the most exhaustive collection of studies related to Kennewick Man, that Thomas W. Stafford Jr., who was the head of much of the carbon dating for Kennewick Man, he admitted and noted that 5 of the approximately 20 carbon date studies for Kennewick Man actually produced dates that were much more recent and fell only 2,000 to 2,700 years ago. He then ended up discarding those newer dates and going with the older dates. But when people say that Kennewick Man is proved to have been over 8,000 years ago, that's not true. Instead, much of the carbon dating shows the older date, but several of the carbon dates actually showed a newer date that fits the Book of Mormon time frame. And in my book, I talk about, and in that prior video, that Kennewick Man video, I talk about the reasons for that. And it comes down to carbon dates can be contaminated with artificial aging, especially if the skeleton is exposed to artificially old water sources. Here it was a glacial old water melt off that the skeleton was, unfortunately, the ground that it was in was sitting in, which could cause drastically artificially aged dates. In other words, make something look a lot older than what it is. And actually, in that same chapter of the book, it talks about how they tested the soil around Kennewick Man, and the majority of the soil dates produced impossibly old dates. What do I mean by impossibly old? It was producing dates that were older than a volcanic layer below them. So what that means is obviously the way things pile up in terms of sedimentation, you can't be older than the ground below you. But when they tested the soil that Kennewick Man was buried in, or his body was placed in, the majority of the dates for that were producing impossibly old dates, impossibly old, older than soil dates below them, which means that the skeleton was in an environment where it was artificially aged and looked older, would test as older than it really is. And it really does explain the testing. So in my view, the Kennewick Man fits Book of Mormon timeframes, but we'll see what it says here. So isn't it true that it produced these dates falling only 2,000 to 2,700 years ago? We'll see what Grok says. Interesting. So he admits it. Okay, he says yes. Chapter 3, Table 3.5, he does report that 5 of the approximately 20 radiocarbon dates for Kennewick Man yielded ages of only 2,000 to 2,700 years ago. Well, I'm impressed with the AI here. So, in the past, as you've seen maybe in the prior one, AI tends to reflect the mainstream sources, and it can be hard to get AI to sort of change or admit when it's wrong. But it's interesting that it's making all the key concessions here. So far, keeping score, it's conceded that Haplogroup X is originated in the Middle East, Near East, and we can't pinpoint specifically, but most likely, the Levant, Israel is one of the key prospects for the origin of this Native American DNA type. It admits that the dating for it is based off of molecular clock, that it admits that the testing of the actual mutation rates are much faster, which put into doubt the reliability of the molecular clock for that. It admits that the only archaeological evidence that it has for a date, this coming before Book of Mormon timeframes is based off of the Kennewick Man. Otherwise, it doesn't have any actual dates before that. And then it admits that in the carbon dating for Kennewick Man, actually several of the dates do yield a time frame, 2,000, 2,700 years ago to 2,700 years ago, that would actually fit the Book of Mormon time frame. So that's great. Let's see if there's any other follow-ups we want to do with Grok. Okay, and then after taking a look at my notes, there are a couple, just another line that I wanted to clear up. So um, we've got it to admit a lot of things, but one of the things that it still will say is that haplogroup X must have come across to the Americas across the Bering Strait through Beringia. But I want to do a question or two on that to see if it has any actual evidence proving that. So I say, in 100 words or less, with regard to how haplogroup X came to the Americas, the mainstream view has been that it must have come across the Bering Strait. But are there any archaeological sites in Beringia or surrounding areas that show haplogroup X or X2A actually being there? Let's see what it says. Very interesting. It admits that there are none. So it says there are no archaeological sites in Beringia or the surrounding areas that have yielded or confirmed haplogroup X or X2A being there. Still relies on the molecular clock, but there is no direct ancient DNA evidence from that area to support this. Very interesting. All right, let's do one last follow-up question or so. Okay, and this would be the last um, icing on the cake type question, just to see in 100 words or less, then are there any archaeological findings that the AI, which again, this AI is sort of the sum collection of the mainstream scientific views that are out there. Are there any archaeological findings that prove haplogroup X2A, that Native American DNA that originated in the Middle East? Are there any archaeological findings that prove it came via Beringia or via the Bering Strait, as opposed to some other route, such as by boat, like as described in the Book of Mormon? And we'll see what it says. Or I accidentally hit the deep search button, which then it takes Grok, the AI, significantly longer because it expands its collection of sources that it'll look for information on. But we pulled it up, and I'll show you what it came to. But in the 100 words or less answer, where I asked, are there any archaeological findings that show haplogroup X DNA came via the Bering Strait as opposed to another route, such as by boat, like the Book of Mormon describes? It admits there are no archaeological findings that prove haplogroup X2A arrived via the Bering Strait as opposed to the other routes. It still goes back to the molecular clock that it relies on, but admits that there's no ancient DNA in Beringia that confirms this. And then it says alternative routes like transoceanic travel by boat. It says it lacks evidence for that. So it doesn't say it can't occur. It just says it lacks evidence, and then talks about a study that tries to argue for the Beringia route. Now, on the deeper search, it took longer. It looked through a lot more sources. It's not limited on the word thing, but what it comes out to after doing its deeper search, it shows, again, after doing its deeper search, it says it still confirms there's no clear evidence or genetic path of X2A across Beringia. It's absent in Siberia, absent in Beringia. I should say absent in Siberia near Beringia. There's actually in central Siberia, which is like a couple thousand miles away west, there's actually a little bit there in the Altai region. But in anywhere near Beringia or eastern Siberia, there's no X2A. There's no evidence that it was there. So there's a lack of archaeological evidence there. And then it said that maybe it means that there's more research that's needed. It's based on the genetic studies. Maybe it didn't come through Beringia. Then it starts to look at other possibilities, like by boat. And then again says no archaeological evidence there. It makes the route uncertain and is open to debate. Still thought to come by Beringia, but it can't be proved that it didn't come by another alternative, such as by boat. All right, that's good enough. Again, the deeper one, I didn't do the 100 words or less because I accidentally just clicked the button. So I'll scroll through it for those interested in looking at it, but I'm not going to read through it since it's so long. And then I will end and summarize. All right. So that was round two. I think we won round two as well. I think we won round one by points. Grok wouldn't admit anything in round one on the Bat Creek Stone. Kept going to ridiculous positions. Admitted a lot of its bases are wrong. But in this round two, I think it's actually more of a TKO because it essentially admitted the Heartland possibility, right? It essentially admitted that haplogroup X does come from the Middle East, specifically Israel as a likely point of origin. On the dating, it maintained its position on that, still relying on the molecular clock, but admitted that the assumptions that it was using for that aren't necessarily reliable because it's only four mutations we're talking about that they're trying to take an average from. And also that pedigree studies showed much faster rates, which if you applied them would actually fit Book of Mormon timeframes. And then in terms of the other evidence of haplogroup X having been here before Book of Mormon times, like on Kennewick Man, it admits that some of that carbon dating actually showed earlier dates, so that could be wrong, and that it's only Kennewick Man that is relying in terms of the carbon dating. And then it also admits that there's no archaeological evidence in the Bering Strait or Eastern Siberia or anywhere that indicates that haplogroup X, this Middle Eastern DNA, came to the Americas via the Bering Strait, as opposed to coming by boat, as described in the Book of Mormon. I am convinced that the DNA evidence is consistent with the Book of Mormon. It doesn't prove it, and that's not the point. The point isn't to prove the Book of Mormon here. The point is to just show that the evidence is consistent with the Book of Mormon, especially when you take a step back and evaluate the assumptions that have been used by the mainstream science in dismissing the Book of Mormon DNA. The DNA is actually not an enemy to the Book of Mormon when you look at what evidence is actually there and the assumptions and that relate to it. So I was encouraged by the debate with Grok here, this round two. Maybe we'll be able to do some more in the future. Look forward to your comments below, and let me know whether you like this format and whether you think that AI won or I won on this round. Thanks.